There are a lot of unintended consequences for 5v5. And even though I could talk about things like the support passive or the solo tanking experience, I think most of those topics have been beat to death, but what hasn't been talked about enough are the heroes that, as of the change to a 5v5 system, just don't really have an identity anymore, or they lost a huge part of their fundamental identity that they had back in 6v6, and they never really got it back. That's why in this video, we're going to talk about the heroes that 5v5 left behind. But it says here that only 20% of you are subscribed, so do me a solid and press that subscribe button if you haven't already, and let's get into it. Now, of course, not every character is going to be the same going from a 6v6 system to a 5v5, with the introduction of role passives and fundamental changes to how certain characters are going to work, not to mention the solo tanking environment. Many characters got reworks or huge fundamental changes, but some of them missed the mark, and other characters didn't get any changes when they probably should have come Overwatch 2. One character that kind of made the change, but her identity is far different than it used to be, is Diva. Diva was one of the most powerful characters in Overwatch for a very long time, one of the core important characters for both dive and Reinhardt related strategies and eventually GOAT strategies. She was super important and super powerful in pretty much every composition that she was in, but she played a much different role than she does today. In fact, today, she can only really do her old role every once in a while, and that role was being an harasser, being a contester, being a punisher, someone that finds someone out of position, goes in and shuts them down, whether that's a hit scan character, whether that's someone off angling. It's also the role of a peeler, someone that went back, protect her team from dives, kind of mitigated a lot of the proactive plays that the enemy team made. And this sort of hybrid role was something that Diva could uniquely do because she wasn't in charge of a lot of the main tanking duties, the contesting of space, the controlling of space. She didn't have to do these things. It was a lot about containing enemy space and also containing off angles, which she can do now, but there's a huge cost to doing this for too long. She's not just someone that can just linger, keeping people in check all the time, because there's other roles that she has to accomplish. So even though Diva is still a really good character today, I think a lot of her identity was lost, and you play Diva now as someone that just kind of sits there and occupies space and sometimes protects your team, and you can kind of play her as a diver here and there, but she doesn't really fill that job great either. And because she's flexible, she's strong, but she doesn't feel as free as she used to be. And I feel like the tanking experience for her, the off-tanking experience that you used to have on her, is really just a shell of what it once was. Now, Diva's an example of a character that didn't get changed that much, but a character that did get changed quite a bit was Reinhardt. Reinhardt now can stop his charge, he has multiple fire strikes, but at his core, Reinhardt is still very similar to the character he used to be. And in a lot of ways, but for different reasons, Reinhardt also got left behind when we talk about 5v5. Now, as the solo tank, not having a natural pairing, someone that can help him bridge the gap between space, help him contest these off angles like we're talking about, these characters don't exist, like Reinhardt naturally paired with Divas and Zaryas, whether that is to create more proactivity on the front line or having someone that can handle the flanks or the off-angling. Reinhardt doesn't have the capability to do that, so naturally pairing with the Diva, it was like a perfect combo of characters that really fit each other and made up for each other's strengths. Now Reinhardt's real huge weaknesses stick out like a sore thumb. So you either have a character that can kind of do it all like Diva, but has lost her sense of freedom, now having to fill too many roles all at once, or a character like Rein, who doesn't have the means to fill the gaps in his weaknesses that a second tank once did. And there's a lot of examples that we have in this category, like Hog needed dramatic reworks, Orisa still doesn't feel like she perfectly fits in a 5v5 environment, and Wrecking Ball is another character that seems to be on the chopping block. Pretty much the tanks that fit the most or the best in an Overwatch 2 5v5 environment are the tanks that were introduced in a 5v5 environment, especially like Ramattra and Junker Queen. These characters feel fun, give you interaction, have an identity, sure, but they fit the game of Overwatch 2 far better, and it's obvious because they were built with 5v5 in mind. And I think that's really important because there are consequences when you build an entire set of characters with one game state in mind, and then that game state fundamentally changes. It doesn't really matter how many tweaks you do to some of these characters if on paper they don't really make that much sense for a 5v5 environment. And if you were to make these characters in a 5v5 environment, you might have completely different types of abilities that allow them to have a better experience in that environment. And I also want to make this clear, we're not just talking about tanks. DPS and supports both have characters that just literally feel like they don't have a place in 5v5. So let's talk about the DPS first. First off on the chopping block is Cassidy, a character that his hard CC just didn't match up to the vision of 5v5, so they got rid of it, replaced it with a really crappy ability, honestly, in Magnetic Grenade. But more importantly than that ability is Cassidy's identity, which doesn't really fit in the new environment in the same way that other characters like Soldier 76 have kind of slotted into the new 5v5 system and even thrived in this environment, or characters that have been created in the 5v5 system like Sojourn that obviously have mobility, have high burst damage, have range. There's a lot of things that these characters have that Cassidy just does not. He doesn't really have any strength that sticks out over other characters. And the one strength that it made sense to give him, hard CC at close range, didn't fit the new design philosophy of the game. So instead of compromising in some way, they just gave him no strength at all. Other characters that seemingly got left behind are the two one-shot characters, where Blizzard just doesn't really know what to do with them. They have a new design philosophy. They don't like one-shots. They want to reduce that. But these characters have already been created, so they don't know how they dramatically change them. And their only compromise was to have a character like Widowmaker, just fragile and also not consistent from range. Even though it's very hard to adequately judge that range, it just feels like a weird design overall. And I think a lot of these characters, especially one-shot snipers and characters like that, were less of a problem in a 5v5 environment where there was characters that could basically keep these characters in check and things like that. And those characters don't exist anymore, and the power of a one-shot rises dramatically in that environment. So it put Blizzard in kind of a weird situation with these characters. And in addition to that, I think other types of characters, other types of combos become more dominant under the new 5v5 system. Like if we're talking about pocketed DPS, those become really powerful and problematic, like Pharah Mercy, for example, which when you had a tank that could maintain space and a tank that could contest characters like Pharah, so like you have a Reinhardt on the front line with a Diva that could contest the Pharah or keep the Pharah in check. Well, it wasn't always a perfect system. I don't want to like paint 6v6 as like this perfect thing. It's really just a difference in design, right? I don't think that one necessarily needs or is objectively better than the other, but when you build all these characters with 6v6 in mind, and then you swap to 5v5, the consequences kind of ripple throughout the entire cast. Like, yeah, you could build a badass 3-wheel car, and it's gonna run, it's gonna go fast, all that stuff. And you could build a badass 4-wheel car, and it could be awesome as well. But if you build an amazing 4-wheel car, and then randomly change it to 3 wheels, there's gonna be complications. Like the weight's not going to hold up and the measurements aren't going to fit right, and we're seeing some of those consequences here. And of course, a lot of characters did get changes fundamentally to more match the system. Like Sombra obviously stuck out like a sore thumb going into the new game, so they kind of nipped her in the bud and changed her right away. They got it wrong, they nipped her again, and I think now she's in a much more competitive and not oppressive state. Like she's in a pretty balanced state. But of course, I do got to talk about supports, and supports has been one where the consequences has kind of rippled throughout the entire game. Well, we've already seen some dramatic changes where, like Zenyatta, for instance, has been a character where Discord was incredibly controversial because that Discord has less people to go on, right? There are less people to go on and there's only one tank, so it's really easy to kind of hyperfixate it. So they had to do all these dramatic changes to first weaken Discord, but then it weakened his identity as like this glass cannon, so they gave him more health, and that goes against his glass cannon status. So you're like changing the whole identity of a character to match this, where I don't ever think that they would create a Zenyatta for Overwatch 2. If he was like a character that they were making or introducing into the game, they wouldn't make him in this way. And there's a lot of characters that I like that. I think Lucio, even though he's still good in like scrim coordinated play, he is losing a lot of his identity from Overwatch 1. The need for speed, right? The speed boost used to be known as the most powerful ability across the board, and it really was very strong. But these days, I don't really think speed is even that powerful compared to a lot of other cooldowns, mainly because having mobility and being movable and flexible and fighting from off angles and not all sticking together is super powerful these days, as opposed to before, where coordination, moving together, you got an extra person to get that speed, especially an extra tank, more impactful. Not saying Lucio's bad, but a lot of these characters' identities are not really perfectly aligned with the 5v5. It's kind of like they've made it work, but it really doesn't fully work. I think a great example of how this could happen is like if they took League of Legends and they just like removed one of the roles, right? And every character would have crazy ramifications for that, because every character plays off of the other roles. Like, everything is connected, all the eco's connected, all the balance is connected. Same way with Overwatch, where everything is connected. And I think a lot of the problems that we're running into are the characters that are either getting left behind, they don't feel satisfying, or they lost their identity coming into Overwatch 2, or characters that obviously have abilities that don't really make sense to have made in like a 5v5 environment. Like, no one would ever create something like Sleep and Nade and put them on the same character in a world where there's only one tank, right? If that's the game that you're building, it doesn't make sense to do those things at the same time. Same thing with stuff like Discord. Same thing with Afar or Mercy, when there's not as many characters to keep these things in check. The ultimate point I'm making is I don't really think that 5v5 or 6v6 is the right argument to be having. I think you could make a game that is fun and balanced and cool in 5v5. You could make a game that's fun and balanced and cool in 6v6, but when you do one and then try to brute force it into the other, without really changing things around and changing things around often and thinking more about what do these characters need to do? How do you preserve the gameplay experience and make things fun for people, not just balance things around a number? I think that there's way too much number balancing where you're just trying to match everything to, oh, this character has a 50% win rate, so they're good. When I think a better exercise would be like, take a character, imagine what you would do if you were going to create the character today. Like if you were going to add in that character, a brand new character to Overwatch 2 in a 5v5 game, what would that character's abilities look like? What would they do? How would you build a character that is fun to play, interactive, and, you know, also not super frustrating to play against or with, but still has the same sort of fundamental identity as the original version, and then maybe make adjustments towards there so that you still have a really fun, interactive, interesting character, and it's not a square that you're trying to jam into a like triangle hole, right? Anyways, let me know down below if you agree or disagree with my take here, and is there any characters that you think they don't quite live up to the 5v5 environment and they really need to be dramatically changed to meet the vision for what the character would be under a 5v5 if they were created there? Let me know down below and smash the like, subscribe if you enjoy the content. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.